show its importance in the history of Egyptology, which, as you will see, is enormous. We are on the western bank of Thebes, and what you can see in this picture is the so-called Theban mountain, in reality a plateau in the bowels of which hide a series of necropolises, the most famous of which is unquestionably the Valley of the Kings, intended for the rulers of the 18th to the 20th dynasties. However, there are many others, such as the Valley of the Queens, where the spouses of the rulers are buried, as well as the children, Dra Abu el-Naga, mainly intended for high officials, the necropolis of El Asasif of a later period, and then also the Valley of the Nobles and Deir el-Medina. In this picture you will also recognize the funeral temple of Queen Hatshepsut, also known as the Temple of Deir el-Bahari. While to its left, there is the temple of Montuhotep II, who reunified Egypt. As you can see, the Valley of the Kings is shown to be a particularly rugged terrain. But don't let these well-marked tracks in the picture deceive you, because it is a large-scale building of contemporary accommodation. In reality, once sealed, the tombs, which are totally subterranean, were not meant to be recognizable in order, naturally, to avoid the continual looting. Something which was not successfully avoided because, as we shall see, even the tomb of Tutankhamun, although almost intact, was visited and looted at least twice. The protagonist of our lesson today is obviously Howard Carter, that is, the man who discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. Carter had been working for a long time in Egypt before he arrived at the sensational discovery. He had worked in particular with the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie, learning the job from him. Here you can see a very famous picture, that of the first autopsy examination of the tomb of Tutankhamun. The other protagonist is, of course, the very famous Lord Carnarvon, who was the patron, the one who, through his financial support, enabled the funding of the searches in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Howard Carter had worked in Egypt for a long time, and only 6 years earlier had at last gained a permit to excavate in the Valley of the Kings, amid widespread skepticism, in truth, because it was believed that the valley had by now been exhausted, or at least that all there was to find had already been found. Yet finally, in 1922, the 4th November to be precise, while Lord Carnarvon was in England, Carter comes upon the first step of a stairway that would lead right to the tomb. He does not, however, feel comfortable about excavating without the presence of his patron, and so he blocks it all up and sends a telegram to England. Lord Carnarvon heads first to Alexandria and then finally to Luxor, and at the end of November, the excavation of the famous stairway commences. They arrive next at what you see here, that is, a series of sealed doors with the distinctive seal of the necropolis of the Valley of the Kings, with the 9 chained enemies surmounted by the jackal god, Anubis. There is clearly much emotion, but if you look closely, the door at the bottom of these stairs has already been opened and resealed. At this point, everyone would naturally have thought that there would be little to find inside, but instead, when at last the final door was opened, Carter could say, "I see wonderful things." You must imagine that at the bottom of the stairway that we have just talked about, Carter found himself facing this room, the so-called antechamber. Inside the antechamber, although in a state of some disorder, they could observe 3 beds, evidently 3 ritual funeral beds. A beautiful white trunk with a picture of the ruler Tutankhamun out hunting, carriages which had been sawn when the burial had taken place, and a whole series of vases, including these strange ovoid containers, which would be revealed later to be food containers. At first glance, naturally, Carter would not have been able to see closely how many objects were contained there. But you should know that in the first antechamber alone, more than 700 objects were later discovered. The antechamber is one of 4 areas which make up the tomb of Tutankhamun. Behind it, an annex, obviously the funeral chamber or mortuary, whatever you wish to call it, and then a treasure chamber, where the remains of Tutankhamun had been conserved. Protecting the remains of the ruler were these 2 statues, of which you can see an example here, of the Ka of the ruler, namely one of the souls, the vital spirit of the ruler. It is black in color, as we said earlier about the symbolism of this color, It represents all that is prosperous, alive, and so it is the ruler himself who watches over his mortal remains. The emptying of the tomb was very slow. Just think, Carter took 10 years, and this was because of the meticulous attention with which he catalogued each individual object in the 4 rooms. In December, Carnarvon and Carter had to seal the tomb and go to Cairo to acquire linen cloths, to be able to gradually wrap the objects as they found them, placing them on sedan chairs. This is in fact one of the statues of Ka, which we have seen previously, and pull them out. The other thing which strikes us in particular and which is worthy of a present-day archaeologist is that before carrying out this operation, each individual piece was given a number, so that it could be photographed before its removal from the tomb, during its transport and naturally after its restoration, at least provisional, which happened in another adjacent tomb, the tomb of Seti II, which was used for storage. Carter was so patient and so scrupulous that he waited a good 4 years before reaching the funeral chamber. He found traces of looting everywhere, even, just imagine, the flasks of those who had gone in to take away the gold and oils and who had abandoned them on the ground. Finally, in 1926, he arrived at the funeral chamber, and what he saw, even in these circumstances, was truly sensational. What you see immediately behind the door is not a wall, as one might think. It is the external wall of a gigantic wooden shrine. That is, a wooden box, which in turn contained 2 other wooden boxes, which contained 3 golden wooden anthropoid sarcophagi, human-shaped, which contained finally the golden sarcophagus described as rishi, that is, plumed, within which were found lastly the remains of Tutankhamun. Removing these shrines, these boxes, was very complicated. So as not to damage them, Carter placed mattresses between the walls of the funeral room, which as you can see is not decorated, in order to avoid any scratches as far as possible. What he saw was not frankly very reassuring. Tutankhamun only reigned for a very short time. We have already said that he was not a great ruler. He was buried in haste and was badly treated as far as his embalming was concerned. His body was laid askew, so it will certainly have moved as it was being transported, wounded on one side moreover. Furthermore, far too much oil was used making the body stick to the box. It was literally glued to the box, and it was very difficult to pull it out. Here are the wooden shrines which we talked about. This is the biggest one. It is around 5 meters long by 3.5 by 2.7 meters high, so truly enormous. They are conserved, as is all the treasure of Tutankhamun, at the Museum of Cairo. The other picture gives you an idea of the extraordinary elegance of the jewels which adorn this tomb. The very famous funeral mask displays a nimis, that is, this striped starched handkerchief. Recently, the mask of Tutankhamun has been somewhat in the international limelight as the beard was detached and not very well reattached. Here are some of the furnishing mainly contained inside the treasure chamber. This large golden wooden box contains the organs of the ruler, which are in turn sealed inside these 4 alabaster canopic jars, to protect the innards of the ruler, which was evidently very important, so that the soul could recognize the body of the deceased, was this splendid Anubis on whom there was also a small shawl, later removed. The most beautiful object of this series of pictures is certainly the crown worn by Tutankhamun, on which you will recognize the 2 ladies, the vulture and the cobra. Needless to say, the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun has been at the center of attention of Egyptologists and others. A major international project called Tutankhamun Family Project has tried to work out who were the closest relatives of this ruler, because until a short time ago,